Buddhist wisdom. It is part of the agenda of writing, and most of those epics, the great fivefold epics of Tamil, Old Tamil, you know about Silappadigaram, Manimekhalai, and all the great five epics of the Tamil old language, through which they claim classical status. Most of them were influenced by the ethics of these Shramana traditions, especially Jainism and Buddhism, and also Ajivaka philosophy, Ajivigasm. It has also influenced those great epics, and it is on the ethics of these religions that the early Tamil epics were codified and written and composed and propagated and disseminated among the people. So it was largely secular, largely dealing with social life, largely dealing with issues of morality and what you call the social contexts and codes and norms and practices in society. And it was devoid of the so-called Varna worldview, the stratified, divided worldview of caste is literally absent from the early Sankham writing. That is the peculiarity of it. So it shows that it predates the arrival of the Chaturvarnya or the fourfold caste system in South India. And with examples and illustrations from these early epics, you can, the historians in general, historians of South India and also in Kerala, they conclude that Brahmanism as a major ideology and Varna as a social stratifying engineering system of society, it reached South India, the Tamilagam and the parts of Kerala only after the 5th and 6th centuries. And only after the 8th century it was consolidated into a kind of watertight caste, compartmentalized, demarcating system. So this is the kind of situation, historic fact that we have in South India. In comparison to North India, where caste and Brahmanism was on, the Vedic hegemony was on from even before the time of Buddha, from BC 1000 or so onwards, because most of the Indian historians are unanimous in their opinion that it is somewhere around BC 1500 that the devastation of the Indus Valley civilization occurred. So by the time of the Buddha, anyway, we can know through the Pali Canon and various other recent historiographical works, by the time of the Buddha, by BC 6th century, it has deteriorated into a degraded, dehumanized form of untouchability, and the caste system was here in practice. So I was just sketching the broader historical outline and the kind of groundwork for defining Kerala, what it is, and how it came to existence, when was this term used, and what constitutes Kerala and all, in this broader perspective or broader paradigm of the cultural and the social landscape of India and South India in particular. So what we call as Kerala today is only a post-1960s phenomenon as part of the linguistic state creation, but the terms like Kerala or Cherala were existing in the Middle Ages itself. Historians claim that. So the historic formation of Kerala, that is to be critically understood. Then only we can talk about writing in Kerala and the kind of literature that produces writing and the kind of literature that represented caste, or the literature that resists caste, or the literature that reiterates caste. So first it is very important to identify these historic traditions and trajectories and civilizational changes and shifts in the formation or in the genealogy of this category of Kerala. So as I mentioned, Sangham age is the beginning of available literature, now available literature in South India. And it was, as I told you, it was untouched by caste. There were plenty of communities. It was a kind of a landscape-oriented aesthetics and cosmology they had. The various tribal clans were there, conflicting clans were there were wars and feuds and things like that. But there was no mention of untouchability. There is no reference to the practices of caste or ostracism or pollution or purity or the Varna, Sangara issues or nothing like that. So it was largely casteless. That is the marked feature of the Sangham literature. And as I told you, it operated on an aesthetics based on ecology. Landscape was prominent, and each group resided in clans residing in various territories. They composed their poetry and they created their art with primary reference to the landscape. That is called the Tinai concept, the Tinai Sangalpam, the fivefold Tinais. It is in Tinai, in Tamil it is called the Tinai. So there were 5 categories of landscape and compositions of poetry or prose. It is done accordance to that, according to the eco-aesthetics of that region. The cultural markers, the imagery, the symbols, the kind of conventions used in articulation, all these things will be in accordance with the cultural landscape. Environment plays an important part in the Tinai concept. So, in those days of Sangham literature, we are talking about the last centuries of BC and the early AD centuries, the first centuries of the early Common Era. So, in those days, though it was patronized by the chieftains and local kings, women were there as poets. You talk about Avvaiyar and Nachinar and plenty of other women poets. So a large presence of women poets, that is the marked feature, the most what you call advanced democratic feature, as you call that you can find in Sangham era. And also most of the greater poets, they belong to the current Dalit kind of castes or communities, whether it is Shatanar, who composed Manimekhale, which is a Buddhist kind of an epic, or plenty of others, Pakanar, Pravanar, plenty of poets. Most of them, those who are anthologized in Agam poetries and Puram poetries, most of them belong to the so-called Dalit communities of today. They belong to Kurava or Paraya or Puleya castes and clans. So that is a very important feature of the Sangham age. And from that historical fact, we can arrive at the conclusion that the kind of caste system and untouchability and casting away of basic working communities of people, it was absent. It was not known to those people and era. That is the conclusion. And women were accepted as poets, and some of the greatest poets were women. So this is what we have to mark. And this continued up to the 5th or 6th centuries, and afterwards you have all these castes, all these poets and great artists becoming slaves. So all of a sudden, after the 8th century, after the period of Shankara and other Vedic Pandits, you have these basic communities turning into slaves. This is the kind of turmoil that happens between the 6th and 8th century. So by that time, historians of Kerala and South India, they argue that Brahmanism was established here and Chadurvarnyam was enforced here. The local chieftains were assimilated as Kshatriya by the Brahman, the priestocracy. They somehow got here as main priests and chief priests and advisors to the kings and queens, and they claimed or they achieved a kind of political leverage, and they converted the queens and kings, and the royalty and the elites were with them, and they established their regime of priestocracy and phallic patriarchy. Scholars like Kumar Chakravarti, historians like Kumar Chakravarti calls it the what you call the Brahmanic patriarchy, which is a double hierarchy according to feminist historians like Kumar Chakravarti. She calls it a double hierarchy because there is a hierarchy of Varna and caste, and also there is a hierarchy of gender. So that is why she calls it Brahmanic patriarchy. Both caste hierarchy and gender hierarchy is so it is intrinsically wedded to this kind of a patriarchal system, which is a aristocratic as well, which mediates between this world and other, and between the mortals and the so-called the claimed immortal space of the transcendental God. So this kind of a system was established, and those who submitted to it, those who subscribed to this this new version of social engineering, this new spirituality, this new canon of the Vedas, those who accepted this Vedic, what you call omnipotence, were accepted into the Hindu fold, into the Chaturvarnya Sanatana system, or which is also called the Varnashrama Dharma. Gandhi has even written a book called the Varnashrama Dharma, and Navjeevan, they have published it. He defends the Varnashrama Dharma. According to him, only untouchability must go. Eradication of untouchability was his agenda, the Harijanodharana agenda, and even that term Harijan, it was rejected by the Dalits in his own time. We know about the debates between Gandhi and Ambedkar, and this Varnashrama Dharma was in practice here in South India, and Andhra also. This region also forms the part of the ancient Tamilagam. So that is why I am talking about Tamilagam as a whole. So Varnashrama system, the Chaturvarnya system was here, and those who submitted to it, those who engaged with it in a very, very embracing way, they were embraced by Brahmanism and given the Varna status. The chieftains were made into Kshatriya kings. The other classes, the elites, they were given some Vaishya or Shudra kind of positions. And those who never submitted to this Vedic hegemony, they were casted away as untouchables. It's also endorsed by Ambedkar himself. According to him, the untouchables, who are the Shudras, who are the untouchables, these questions these pertinent, serious questions in Indian history, it was first asked on an epistemological level by Ambedkar himself, and he addressed these issues. And according to Ambedkar and all the other subaltern scholars and theorists, it is the non-submitting people, those who never subscribed to the Brahmanical worldview and the hegemony of the Vedas, they were casted away as untouchables, and they were mostly they were Jains and Buddhists and non-believers and heretics and Ajivagas and people who resisted caste. And Buddhists were the foremost, or they were leading in that group. They never accepted. Jainism has considerably accepted in order to save the life some of the Jains had to convert and get a place as a submissive intermediary caste within Brahmanism, within the Hindu order. But most of the Buddhist laity, they never compromised with it, and they were casted away as untouchables, as marginal men, as broken men in the terms used by Ambedkar. So they formed the masses in India, the Bahujans, the Dalit Bahujans in India, and the most enslaved people of South India, the basic Dalit communities, and also some of the Adivasi communities. They are at the receiving end, and they are at the bottom of things today. And I think, looking at the history of South India, when you analyze the kind of historical formations, you can identify their ancestors in the Sangam age, in the poets and artists and other composers of the Sangam age. These surnames, these community names are repeated and reiterated. So I think this kind of a tradition, a long tradition of writing, a long tradition with letters of the alphabet, a long critical engagement with culture and resistance, it is there with the untouchable people, the Avarnas, and some of the historians, especially subaltern historians of Kerala, subscribe to the view that the Avarnas, the untouchables, the Dalits in particular, they belong to some of the Buddhist groups and sections, and that is why they never submitted to the kind of casteist practices enforced on them by Brahmanism, and they're fighting against the worldview of the caste, and they constitute most of the minorities, whether it is Islam or Christianity or Sikhism or Neo-Buddhists or Jains. These people have resisted caste, and it is their life itself can be their struggles itself, their history itself can be termed as a kind of long struggle against caste, and they are writing with their lives. So that kind of a life writing you can associate with this long resistance to caste and Vedic obscurantism in South India and in Kerala, which we will have to realize when you have to look at in the broader historical perspective. We will realize this. So from the 8th century onwards, you have the shift. You have the Vedas coming as hegemonic texts, and you have the slight changes in language, because with Brahmanism, with Hinduism, you have the Sanskritic tradition coming. So it is having some kind of dialogue and engagement with the native Tamil dialects, various dialects, and also the creation of a new kind of intermediary language, which is marked as Bhasha, which is marked as Manipravala in Kerala in the Middle Ages. In post 8th and 10th centuries, in the 12th and 13th centuries, you have a different version of language, Bhasha, to use the term from G.N. Devi, or the vernacular, evolving a different kind of vernacular, to use the words of Susithani. Vernacular evolving as a kind of a strange hybrid kind of a form. So that is called Manipravala. In Malayalam literary history, it's called Manipravala. It means a kind of strange, queer combination of Sanskrit and Malayalam. And some of the early available, now recovered available texts are written in this particular idiom called Manipravala, which is strange, which is highly Sanskritized, which is a product of the elite imagination, which is which reflects the worldview of caste, of course. The caste feudal society is reflected in it. So by the 13th and 14th century, this hegemonic order has created a feudalistic, phallocentric worldview and its linguistic correspondent in the so-called Manipravala. That is evident. It is visible in the Pattu Sahitya, or the song Sahitya, and especially in Ramakatha Pattu and some of the Chambu compositions. This is evident. The strange mix-up of Sanskrit and early Malayalam Tamil. It was not even called Malayalam in 13th and 14th centuries. It is called it's a transitional phase between the old Tamil and the current Malayalam. That is the Malayalam Tamil. The earliest recognized work, authentic work in Malayalam, which is supposed to be Ramakatha Pattu, which was composed in the 13th or early 14th century, which is supposed to be in this Malayalam Tamil, not even in Malayalam. It is Malayalam Tamil. It's a transitional phase, and considerable Sanskritic words or equivalents were there in this particular composition. So this is the kind of transformation of society, the Varna system transforming society, and also that worldview and epistemology, that cosmology of the Vedas and its Sanskritic imagination changing the language. And today you have almost 50 to 60% of words in Malayalam are from Sanskrit roots. But still there are Tamil words and Pali words. And Pali, the presence of Pali, 20 to 30% of words in Malayalam, in contemporary Malayalam, is Pali, the ancient Arthamagathi tongue used by the Buddha and also by the Jain monks. Both of these schools, heterodox traditions who questioned God and who questioned the other world and the spirit, they used Pali, which was the native language of some parts of North India, and which was spoken by the common people. And Buddha's visionary kind of far-sighted kind of judgments, he used Pali, the common people's language, for propagating gospel, and also he used women as missionaries to very democratic, advanced kind of moves by Buddha. And even today you find 20 to 25% of words in Malayalam, in present Malayalam, are Pali. It shows that Kerala, or the people of Kerala, they had a kind of continuous engagement with Pali and Pali speaking people. And that again is a linguistic evidence, is a cultural and linguistic evidence of Kerala's Buddhist past, Buddhist and Jain past. And plenty of archaeological and cultural evidences are also there, architectural evidences are there, practices, medicinal practices, practices of literacy, writing. Some of the communities themselves, like Ezhuthachan, who was Hinduized later in the 16th century, who actually founded the Rama image, who actually concretized the Rama worship in Kerala. That happened only in the 16th century, only after the coming of Portuguese, only after the Western intervention. This Adhyatma Ramayana of Ezhuthachan was composed, and that is recognized as the first complete work in the total comprehensive work in Malayalam, full-fledged Malayalam. Even Ramakatha part of the 14th century, it was written in Malayalam Tamil. So that is the kind of transition. So the kind of Malayalam language that is used today, or today's Malayalis can read only up to Ezhuthachan. That is a 16th century work, this Adhyatma Ramayana. And beyond that you cannot go. Beyond that it is Tamil and Manipravala and a strange kind of Tamil, old Tamil. So today's Malayalam, it has only a legacy of 400 years. That is true. That is the truths regarding this language, and the kind of identity that is associated with Kerala and Malayalam as something ancient, and now some of the groups are going for classical claims, and they are after the central fund and 100 crores of money and things like that. So they are claiming classical status as Sanskrit and Tamil and some of the other ancient languages. So that is part of the kind of Malayali nationalism and the elite Malayali politics that we discussed in the morning. Engagements with caste. So only in the 16th century, Eഴുത്തച്ഛൻ composed his Adhyatma Ramayana, and that is after the threats, the kind of military and political threats from the Portuguese. The Portuguese were here in Malabar and in Goa and Calicut and all. The Portuguese were here, and only after that he composed that song, that long narrative, epic-like poem in praise of Rama. And that actually Rama was as presented as a Purushottama, as an ideal god for all the common people only in the 16th century. Before that, Rama was never mentioned in any of the. Of course, in Ramakatha Pata he is there, but as a god, as an idealized kind of a deity, he was established especially among the common people, only in the 16th century. So the Ramicization of Kerala happened only in the 16th century after the coming of the Portuguese. And after that you have plenty of Bhakti literature, you have Pundaram, you have Bhattadiri, you have plenty of writers coming from the elite sections, from the upper caste, Savana sections of society, and all of them were writing about Rama and Krishna, and some of them about Shiva and Bhagavati and all. The Shaivite and Vaishnavite kind of streams were also there. And till the 20th century, this stream of the Hindu writing, it's Bhagavata kind of cosmology, it's meta-referential structure, the pantheon, including all the incarnations of the Vishnu, and all these things were here. The Bhagavata was translated into Malayalam and all. In early 20th century, Vallathol translated Valmiki Ramayana itself. Mahabharata was translated. So this is the kind of writing that evolved over the ages, and the kind of Hindu sensibility. It is a post 14th century or post 16th century, to be precise, post 16th century phenomenon in Kerala. That is my point. As I mentioned earlier, the kind of contestation of this worldview, this hegemonic Hindu Vedic obscurantic worldview, it happened in the 19th century, again with British intervention. After the Portuguese intervention, you have the Adhyatma Ramayana and a revival of the, not exactly revival, an implanting of the, if you talk about India as a whole, it's a revival, but if you talk about Kerala in particular, it's a kind of a first implanting of the Rama Hindu tradition. And after the intervention of the British and after the missionary intervention of these LMS and CMS missionaries in 19th century, especially in South Kerala, in Travancore, in South Travancore called Nanjinad, there were some kind of resurgences among the common people. So these missionaries were working among the common people, especially the untouchables, the Avarnas in particular, and they were educating them, they were giving free education and healthcare and other benefits of colonial modernity. They were imparting those things to them. And after that intervention, there was some kind of upheaval. There was the breastcloth struggles in Nanjinad, in Travancore, South Travancore, starting in mid-19th century. Just before that, you have the kind of Samatva Sangha, an egalitarian movement founded by Ayya Vaikunthan, or Vaikuntha Swami as he is called now. He is emerging from the Nadars in early 19th century in South Travancore. And this emergence of Ayya Vaikunthan and his preaching of egalitarianism, his preaching of a casteless society, he was the first person in South Travancore to talk about a casteless society. He was the first person to initiate a Sangha called Samatva Sangha, an order, a sect irrespective of caste and other social cleavages. And this is a direct response of the missionary intervention in Nanjinadu, in South Travancore. And after him, you have, of course, is closely followed in time by Narayana Guru's movement. And Narayana Guru, as you know, he addressed the untouchables, especially the communities of Iravas and other intermediary untouchables. They were just above in the caste hierarchy, they were above the Dalits, but below the caste Hindus, below the Nayars and other caste Hindus. So he, through his compositions, through his writings, in Ayya Vaikunthan, you have already some books. He wrote in Tamil. He composed his verses in Tamil, and it's called Uchi Padippu. It's a kind of higher learning. He was invoking a kind of Vaishnavite, liberal Vaishnavism. He was a sage in disguise. He was an untouchable. He came from the Avarna Nada community. He was an untouchable, so he was not allowed actually to worship in temples, and he was prohibited from entering the sacred spaces of the caste Hindus, but still in a kind of very liberal, guerrilla-like, disguised Vaishnavism, he was communicating the messages of egalitarianism and anti-caste activism among the untouchable people. So he composed, not actually wrote, but he composed as verses, oral verses, Uchi Padippu and Akhila Thirattu. These are the two important works of Ayya Vaikunthan. Uchi Padippu means higher level of learning. He's talking about the absolute again, but in a very egalitarian, democratic sense. Everybody has a place for the has an opportunity for this higher learning. The untouchable or women, they also have this higher learning potential according to him. So that is what he called Uchi Padippu, which is a text. Now it is codified into a text in Tamil, Uchi Padippu. And Akhila Thirattu. Akhila Thirattu means talking about everything, the cosmology of Ayya Vaikunthan. That is explained in his work Akhila Thirattu, and it is composed as a folk song, as a folk ballad. Akhila Thirattu Ammani, as an Ammani part. Ammani part means a juggler's kind of song, as a wandering minstrels and jugglers, they have the song. So in those folk ballad forms, he somehow explained a kind of veiled and disguised form of egalitarianism as a disguising himself as a Vaishnavite saint. But he was actually talking about a casteless society. It was he who proclaimed that all human beings are one, and there is only one God. If at all there is a God, there is only one God, and all human beings are one, he said. And Narayana Guru was actually reiterating and reinforcing and very logically rationalizing this early seminal contribution by Ayya Vaikunthan. And he addressed, and he wrote in Malayalam, that is his another important liberative aspect. He was talking to Malayali people, means not just to South Travancore, Nanjinadu Tamil speaking communities, but also he was addressing the communities from this Travancore to Malabar. They were speaking they shared this common tongue called Malayalam by this time, by the late 19th century. Some kind of Malayalam or various dialects of Malayalam was spoken in this region, south of the Tamil Nadu, the South Canara regions. So, Narayana Guru in his works, he was a scholar in Malayalam and of course, and also in Sanskrit and in Tamil. So, he composed his verses he has sat down and written some of these verses, and he composed a kind of very liberal and an inclusive kind of a new world order. A kind of preaching which was available to common people in their common tongue. And his works like Atmopadesha Shatakam or Daivadashakam and plenty of other philosophical ruminations and compositions, they address the kind of humanness that is innate to human beings. And in a short poem called Jati Nirnayam, he has even proclaimed that as animalness is the quality or caste of animals, humanness is the quality or caste of humans. Humans have no other caste but humanity, or humanness itself is the caste. We can only differentiate between the animal and the human, and not among the human themselves. So that kind of philosophical refutation of the logic of caste, which was enforced here as part of religion, as part of the Vedic metaphysics, as part of Vedanta. Even the philosopher who composed Advaita, he was practicing untouchability. You know about an untouchable teaching, Shankara, about the futility of asking him to give way. Also, that kind of a perverted logic of caste was prevalent here, especially in Kerala, from at least the time of Shankara, that is 8th century, 8th and 9th century he lived. So that kind of a logic, that worldview of caste, that divide and rule kind of a policy and vision, that was contested philosophically in a very what you called a communicable and sensitive language by Narayana Guru in some of his shorter compositions, and most of them are done in Malayalam. So as a result and as part of his social praxis, he subverted some of the aristocratic practices like installing the idols in temples. He installed the idols in some of the temples. In 1888, he questioned the Brahmanical monopoly of idol installation at Aruvipuram through his installation by simply placing a stone, a granite stone from the river. He actually subverted the whole history, the whole tradition of Brahmanic priesthood. Till then, in Kerala, only Brahmins were allowed to make such an installation. So he broke that taboo with a simple act. So that kind of different kind of what you call significations were used by Narayana Guru as a social reformer, and as an anti-caste activist. And most of his works, his written compositions, his words deals with a philosophical what you call challenging and contestation of the very logic of caste and the Varna theory. And of course, parallel to this kind of reformism, Vaikunthan, Narayana Guru, and the social praxis of Ayyankali, it soon followed in the last decade of 19th century. You have Ayyankali struggling for the freedom of movement, for the Dalits in particular, for all the untouchables. They were denied access to public roads, and that was changed by the Villuvandi Yatra, the bullock cart, the historic bullock cart ride of Ayyankali. So he followed the social praxis soon, and also you have the rise of Poigai Lappachan in mid-Travancore. This happened in South Travancore. In mid-Travancore, you have the rise of Poigai Lappachan. but unfortunately he was silenced and he was not known to even Malayali readers till very recently. Only 3 or 4 years before the works of Vaigil Appachan was published. The Kerala Sahitya Academy published his writings, his songs and spirituals only recently. In 2010 or 11 it was published by Sahitya Academy. Even today, that book by Sahitya Academy, it is titled as the Songs of PRDS, not as the Songs of Vaigil Appachan or Vaigil Yohanan. His name is absent from the cover and the title page. So there was a kind of extreme silence, extreme suppression, extreme erasure, a kind of epistemological erasure, and a kind of sanctioned ignorance regarding the caste question in the mainstream Kerala literary imagination. The literary homoerotic circles of Kerala, it is truly exclusionary, it is truly hegemonic, and they actually raised a voice like Vaigil Yohanan for almost a century. Almost a century after he was acknowledged, and now he is included in the university syllabus, in college textbooks, and in school syllabus, and all. Now they have started to include him. Only after he was translated into English, so many studies, academic studies on the pioneering studies of Professor Sanal Mohan and others. Vilash has done some work now. So only after this kind of, I was fortunate enough to translate some of his songs into English, and only after this kind of an interest, a global interest in Vaigil Appachan, he was recognized in Kerala. So this is the kind of continuing hegemony. It's an example of the what you call the prolonged kind of hegemony, prolonged kind of silences, the kind of sanctioned ignorance that rules the media, the academia, and the cultural circles in general in Kerala. So exclusion is immense even today. That is the point that I'm trying to make. And parallel to this early 20th century reformism, which is now popularly called as Kerala Renaissance, you have the development of the novel, the prose, again as a product of the Western intervention, the missionary writings, the early writings of some of the missionaries, and Mrs. Collins was invoked here in the morning. So that kind of persons, they developed the genre of the novel in Kerala, in Malayalam. And Mrs. Collins' Slave is one example in which the caste issue is discussed. The Dalit Christian issue is discussed in detail. And another work is by another priest, Christian priest, Lady Kunju, by Archdeacon Koshi. He was a priest, bishop, high bishop. And also Chandu Menon was greatly influenced by the Western tradition of the novel when he composed Indulekh. Saraswati Vijayam by Potheri Kunyambu, Parangudi Parinayam. Plenty of these local writers, Malayalam writers, took up novel as a chief expression for writing about caste, or resisting caste, or trying to reflect on the caste society. So this is again a direct outcome of the Western intervention. The kind of association with the British tradition of the novel, and the kind of fictional work that was available in English, and that prompted these early works of novel. And in poetry, the tradition of the Bhakti school, it was continuing as the chief or dominant or mainstream version of writing, writing about Hindu gods and goddesses, writing stotra kritis and shrutis, and composing hymns and all. It was continuing. It was the fashion of the elites, especially in Sanskrit rhymes and meters that was practiced. Sanskrit meters were considered as highly refined and explanatory of one's scholarship and pedantry and things like that. So that was continuing in early part of the 20th century. And the first major Avarna poet to break that tradition is called Mulu. He's called Mulu. He was a disciple of Narayana Guru, and he was writing about caste, against caste, and he composed his Pulavrutangal. Pulavrutangal means about the Pulaya communities, about Dalits. That is what he wrote. Though he was a non-Dalit, he was an Irava poet, but again, just above the Dalits, below the caste Hindus. So, an untouchable and an Avarna. But the kind of mobility that was available to him as part of the Narayana Guru movement, it gave him a kind of opportunity to write about caste and to fight for the human rights and the cultural capitals of the untouchables. That is why he composed the Pulavrutangal. So that is supposed to be the first major Avarna work in Malayalam composed on the Dalits and the caste question. And also Molu, he learned Pali and he translated the Dhammapada of the Buddha directly into Malayalam from Pali. That is another major contribution that is now forgotten. The first Malayalam translation of the Dhammapada is by Mulu Padmanabh Panikar, and it is directly done from the Pali original, and now it is being republished by his memorial committee in Pathanamthitta, which is his nativity. So he was also close to the legislative, Dalit legislative member called Karumban Devathan, and he composed these Pulavrutangal after receiving certain requests from this particular Dalit leader, and these songs were used by Karumban Devathan in some of his meetings, and he even recited some of these things in the Legislative Assembly, it is said. So this kind of a reformist tradition is associated with Mulu. Then, of course, you have Pandit Karuppan. That is another important name in the history of poetry and writing in Kerala. Pandit K.P. Karuppan is a major poet, again an Avarna poet coming from the fishing community of Dhivaras or Arayas or Valas as they are called. And he is another major Avarna poet to break the conventions of classical elitist poetry in Malayalam, and he furiously wrote about the caste inequality, and he questioned some of the social conventions that were prevalent in the state of Cochin. And he was a teacher of Sanskrit and Malayalam, and he was poo-pooed, he was condemned by his own students, but somehow with his scholarship and through his writing, his power of the creative genius, he reclaimed his space, and he wrote poems like Jadi Kumi, long narrative poems on caste, Jadi Kumi. Its centenary is now being celebrated, and some of the earliest works of drama in Malayalam which deals with the caste question, in which a Dalit is represented as a hero. In novel, you have Potheri Kunyampu creating Marathan Pulayan as the protagonist. That is supposed to be the first major work in which a Dalit character appears as a hero. Marathan Pulayan is the hero or protagonist of Saraswati Vijayam. In Pandit Karuppan's Jati Kumi, you have, in his play Bala Kalesham, you have Jati Kumi is a long narrative poem in a semi-ballad form on the problem of caste and untouchability. On the other hand, Bala Kalesham is a great play in which a Dalit hero is being presented on stage, and it was played to the public in Kochi in early part of the 20th century, and it won wide acclaim even from the Maharaja then ruling in the princely state. And he initiated tremendous social change as a legislator, as a teacher, as a public organizer of social movement, and he organized the first Dalit meeting in Cochin. And when Dalits were denied land to have a meeting, he organized it with the help of his Dalit friend Vallon. He organized it in the backwaters of Cochin. And now they are bringing Narendra Modi for the what you call the commemoration of that Kyle meeting to Kochi. So this is the unfortunate tragedy and the lingering and reiteration and repetition of hegemony. That is my point. So Pandit Karuppan was instrumental in the formation of the first Dalit social movement and organization of Malayas and Charumos in Kochi. And he was one of the earliest poets, earliest Avarna poets, untouchable poets to raise this issue of caste untouchability and inequality, and to advocate for the rights of the Dalits in Malayalam. And his works like Jati Kummi, Udyana Vidana, another long narrative poem, and Bala Kalesham, a piece of drama, all these things have their very powerful potential for social change and social critique, and he critiques the kind of Hindu common sense, the kind of Savarna hegemonic ideology that is prevalent in Cochin during the early part of the 20th century. So, along with Mulu, Pandit K.P. Karuppan is also a name to remember when you talk about writing and caste in Kerala. And then, of course, you have Kumaran Ashan, another disciple like Mulu. He was also a disciple of Narayana Guru, and he chose Buddhist themes for the composition of his poetry, especially in Karuna and in Chandala Pikshugi. He is pulling back to the cosmology and the egalitarian vision of the Buddha for narrating a long romantic kind of a poem. He was also revolutionizing the language, its idiom and its sensibility, and also the worldview. His aesthetics and politics were also deeply delved in a very critical sense against, and it was oriented as a greater critique of society and the caste worldview. But unfortunately, he was also a highly Hinduized kind of a person in some of his works. In certain works, he affiliates himself with the so-called Upanishadic tradition. But most of his works have Buddhist themes. It's a contradiction. It's a contradiction of the split psyche of a Bahujan poet in Kerala in early 20th century, and that is why today there is criticism against Ashan. And also because of this Hindu affiliation or some kind of fixation with the Hindu worldview, though he wrote elaborately on Buddhist themes, in some of his works he showed tremendous affiliations with Hinduism. That is why he viewed the 1921 revolution in Malabar, the Malabar Revolt, which is now being rehabilitated as the Malabar Revolt by historians like N. Manikar and all. So he viewed the Muslims as others, or he, at least in two lines, he represented the Muslims as others and avengeful beings in that particular poem called Duravastha. In Duravastha, a short Khandakavya of Ashan, you have this negative representation of the Muslim. So that is why now today there are minor critiques, especially from the Dalits, and minor critiques against Ashan. But he tremendously, his overall contributions to writing caste and resisting caste, that cannot be undermined. That spirit of anti-caste writing which originated from Narayana Guru or Ayya Vaikunthan. You have it in Ashan. So, Mulur, Karuppan, Ashan, we have seen. And of course, since we discussed about Vaigila Appachan in the morning, I don't want to elaborate on that. I think you all will read the dissertation which is available in the library. Abhilash's dissertation is now available, and soon it will appear on InflipNet, so it is accessible. And also Professor Sanal Mohan has done another brilliant work on Vaigila, but not exactly on Appachan, but on the PRDS movement, history as memory, the politics of the PRDS movement. That's also available now. So I don't want to elaborate on that, how Appachan dealt with the caste question. He never sat down and wrote these things. He was spontaneous. He was an instant kind of a poet or a composer, and he was singing all these things. This is called the songs and spirituals, and some rhythmic kind of narrations. He was narrating these things on the spot, and he was often walking his talk. That is another. He was a kind of walking Buddha, and he was talking always when he walked. So that kind of a guerrilla strategy was adopted because of the material limitations, because people were after him, because both the Hindus, the caste Hindus, and also the dominant Christians, they were after him, after his life. So that is why he was always moving from one place to another when he was talking and when he was singing and all. So he had his guerrilla meetings in Toni Morrison and all, in Beloved and other novels in African American tradition. You have that kind of guerrilla meetings of the blacks, slaves, fugitives in the forest and all. So likewise, Appachan was organizing his meetings in the forest, in the thick vegetations, and in some of the plantations, in darker alleys, under some bridges, or in the slums, or in some of the ghettos of the Kulayas and all, and he was escaping to the back door. So that kind of a very revolutionary, very dynamic, very what you call very interesting life he had, and most of these songs and spirituals were composed on the spot. That is the peculiarity, and that is why there are plenty of versions. There is not a single authentic version that a writer or an author or a versifier faces in a caste society. So since he was addressing and fighting caste so aggressively, so militantly, so creatively, so dynamically, he
14th, 15th century, and the heavy influence of Sanskrit in Malayalam. So this phenomena is not exclusive to Kerala, Malayali language. It was a general phenomena all over India. It happened in Telugu, it happened in Marathi, Bangla, and even in Hindi, Oriya, in all regional languages, except Tamil. Tamil long back actually got Sanskritized. And one very interesting, it's a striking thing we see in this process is that it's not just only Sanskritization of language, but also Sanskritization of history and culture. Means through this modern language, the Brahmanical literary persons and philosophers assimilated these local myths, legends, or linked these legends with the larger Hindu pantheon gods and all that, and culture, many historical things, and all kinds of things. So it was a kind of Brahmanization was happening from that period onwards. It was a very there are many studies, particularly in Telugu, which shows this phenomenon. So how do you see this in a Kerala context? now Sanskritization of Malayali and history and culture, how it was happening simultaneously? Was there any significant, striking things?
As you said, it is a common phenomenon, but there are regional variations. So, in Kerala, it began with the 6th or 7th centuries, and it is still going on. You have the critical works of M.N. Srinivas and all on Sanskritization. And also subaltern historians are looking critically at it. It is an ongoing process, and even it is continuing. Recently, as I mentioned earlier, Modi was in Shivagiri, the abode of Narayana Guru. He was welcomed there by his own disciples. He went to Mallikavu, where Mata Amritanandamayi happens to be an Avarna woman, and she is now working as a chief agent of Hinduization and Sanskritization. And just an example, that is why I am mentioning her. When you take the font, you have the Sanskrit slogas. They have their institutions all around South India and even in the north, and deemed universities and great management institutes and all run by the Amritanandamayi people. And when you take the font, you have the Sanskrit slogas and the invocation of Hindu gods and goddesses and things like that. So it is orchestrated, it is deliberately done by the forces of Varna Dharma. That is my critique of it, my view of that. So it is deliberately done to continue the kind of hegemony, and without it there is no Hindutva. So because all the gods and goddesses, they are appropriated from the Jain deities or Mayana Buddhist deities. For example, Ayyappa, who is supposed to be the most popular lord of popular Hinduism in South India. Even common people from Andhra and Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, they reach. Even people from Maharashtra, they reach there by walking the mountains of Western Ghat, mountains of Kerala. So even he is an appropriated deity. Ayyappa or Shasta is a synonym for the Buddha. Dharma Shasta is the synonym for the Buddha. And a considerable amount of Buddhist traditions went into the making of this strange hybrid deity, in which you have Vaishnavite and Shaiva amalgamation. And that myth of Ayyappa itself reveals that kind of hybridity and scramble. Vishnu becoming a woman, and Shiva as the male, and having their intercourse, two men coming together and having the baby. So this is the strange, queer story behind the construction of Ayyappa. That queer story, myth itself explains the kind of absurdity that is associated with the making of this Hindu god. So even Ayyappa was actually an Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva. He was mentioned in the early Buddhist Pali canons and all as the seat of the Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva. So all the gods, whether it is Murugan or whether it is Kannan of Guruvayur, Murugan of Palani, all the Ayyappa of Shabarimala, all these are appropriated deities. So this is deliberately done by the majoritarian kind of a hegemonic religious formation. That is the Vedic Varnashrama Dharma worldview. So it is deliberately done as a consistent and continuous propaganda and project. So it is not natural. That is my understanding and my critique of that. So this is not a very, but it happens always invisible, always in very subtle and very cultural kind of unconscious ways. Of course, it is propagated in unconscious ways, and it influences the collective unconscious of the people and enslaves them in a very unknown way. But it is deliberately propagated. The ideology and the agendas is part of a hegemonic discourse, and it is part of that larger one world view. So that is my view of that. Very interesting issue.